Stop the world!
Really, once, the invasion of Ukraine happened, we stopped hearing about what was happening to women and girls in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover. The situation is more repressive than ever for women and girls who don't have the right to work, who can't go to school, and the news rolls on.
Stop the world, at least for half an hour. ASPI's new podcast has landed. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
And we are very happy to bring you this new podcast.
Welcome to old and to new ASPI podcast listeners. We are indeed thrilled to introduce you to Stop the World, which gets beyond the news headlines and takes a deep dive with special guests on issues ranging across defence, tech, cyber, geopolitics and foreign policy.
Each week we'll bring you conversations with the best minds and voices to examine what's happening in our region and across the globe. You'll hear Australian and international perspectives on everything from rising authoritarianism to climate change and from armed conflict to disinformation.
In this first episode, ASPI's Executive Director Justin Bassey speaks with Elaine Pearson and Daniela Gavshon from Human Rights Watch. Elaine is the organisation's Asia Director and Daniela is Australia Director. ASPI has a strong history of working with Human Rights Watch, which is one of the world's foremost NGOs advocating globally for human rights.
The conversation covers issues and challenges to watch in 2024, the work that Elaine and Daniela are currently doing, and the challenges that human rights researchers and advocates face today.
Frankly, one of the challenges is, for us in Asia, in the time that I've been doing this, I'm also seeing the space shrink in terms of our access to countries and really getting boots on the ground to conduct the investigations. So we're also having to become savvier in doing more open source investigations as well.
They also discuss the difficulty of keeping the public focused on the most pressing human rights issues, when multiple crises are competing for attention in a hectic 24-hour news cycle. And they examine the practice of arbitrary detention, the case of Australian writer and academic Dr. Young Hang Jun, and how governments should respond.
One of the things that we've said continuously is, first of all, this is not the only case like this. There are other people who face arbitrary detention in the Chinese legal system and very harsh sentences. And so we have strongly advocated that although the Australian government has said they're appalled and given all the sort of adjectives you'd expect them to give in expressing their outrage at the situation, that they really need to be engaging in concrete actions.
And if that all sounds like cause for despondency, listen to the end because I promise you they'll get around to some of the recent successes we've seen globally.
I think that's about enough from us, Dave. Enjoy the conversation.
I'm Justin Bassey and today I'm delighted to be joined on the ASPI pod by two leading human rights advocates from Human Rights Watch. Elaine Pearson is Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division and former Asia Deputy Director and inaugural Australia Director. Before joining Human Rights Watch in 2007, she worked for the United Nations and NGOs in Bangkok, Hong Kong, Kathmandu and London, with a focus on human trafficking and migration. Daniela Gavshon is Australia Director at Human Rights Watch and previously worked at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, the International Centre for Transitional Justice and in the Australian Government. She is also currently Asia Pacific Liaison Officer of the International Bar Association's War Crimes Committee. Both are absolute powerhouses in the field of human rights and international law, and I'm very pleased to have you join us on the ASPI pod today. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be here.
Wonderful. There can be a tendency to separate human rights and security, but as we've talked about before, the protection and promotion of human rights is vital for security, both as individuals and societies. It's why, despite some different focus areas and at times some different views, there's actually much in common between Human Rights Watch and ASPI, including bringing to light breaches of human rights and holding regimes to account, including through the use of Magnitsky sanctions, for example. A society cannot have security without human rights. So Elaine, I might turn to you first. You've been Human Rights Watch Asia Director since 2022. And in this role, you oversee the work of the Asia Division across more than 20 countries, which is truly a huge remit. Can you tell us a little bit about your role, how you're finding it, and what your main focus has been over the last 12 months?
Yeah, so the Asia Division is the largest programmatic division at Human Rights Watch. We encompass a large portion of the world. Asia for us stretches from Afghanistan, Pakistan to China, all the way down to include, Australia and Papua New Guinea. So we have a very diverse set of countries, from, very functional democracies where the rule of law is largely respected, Australia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, to, completely authoritarian states like the North Korean regime, the Taliban running Afghanistan, China, Myanmar, to the quasi-democracies where, and this is where I think we're seeing a lot of efforts to really erode the democratic process by governments. And this is where we've been doing quite a lot of work the past year, particularly looking at elections and the way in which political opposition is sometimes marginalised, detained, prevented from participating in elections. And then finally, across the board in all of those countries, we look at issues such as freedom of expression, the way that human rights defenders may be harassed, may be intimidated, may be targeted, in some cases imprisoned or worse, even killed for their activism. And they're really the front lines of the work that we do. So, it's a large gamut of different issues ranging from, the countries that are committing crimes against humanity in the region, like China, like North Korea, like Myanmar, to dealing also with, the human rights impacts of climate change and the environment.
It's an extraordinary list of countries and issues, Elaine, covering religion, human rights abuses, freedom of speech issues, cultures, politics, massive countries like China to small Pacific countries. It's incredible that you can stay across it. There must be multiple clones of you. After decades of relative stability around the world, we've re-entered a period of global instability with wars in Europe, war in the Middle East, all that tension and conflict that you're talking about in our region. But what you describe shows that it's not just military conflicts that we face. There's rolling crises now. There are rolling incidents in which human rights are abused. And there are so many of these crises around the world that don't actually make the headlines. They're viewed by people as merely a bit of social or civil unrest. They haven't escalated to military warfare. And of course, places like Australia focus on things like cost of living priority. So how much of that is a challenge for you both as human rights advocates to ensure that people can continue or are continuing to focus on human rights within that context?
Yeah, so we both work at Human Rights Watch on situations of conflict and crisis. We actually have a specialised team of researchers and investigators that are quite experienced in working in war zones and documenting the violations of international humanitarian law that occur by all parties to the conflict. So, we do that anywhere in the world, but we also have in the Asia division country experts, and, they tend to be based ideally in the country that they're covering if security allows for that. And they're also looking at, these broader issues. As you say, it's not just covering the situation when it escalates to a war, but looking at, when protests are erupting, looking at incidents of violence. And really, our role is to expose the pattern of abuses, to look at the perpetrators of who is committing these abuses, and to try and hold those perpetrators to account. And so that advocacy ends up being directed at the government in question, but also our role as a global organisation is really to direct that internationally and to look at what are the pressure points on that government. It may be other governments, it may be through the United Nations, it also may be in some cases through companies that have, important trade interests. And so that's really, I guess, sort of how we do the work. And, frankly, one of the challenges is for us in Asia, in the time that I've been doing this, I'm also seeing the space shrink in terms of our access to countries and really getting boots on the ground to conduct the investigations. So we're also having to become savvier in doing more open source investigations as well. So digital techniques which don't necessarily require a researcher, to go to the site where the abuse occurred, but to find other ways of verifying that information.
And just maybe to add to that as well, just building on what Elaine said, where we have this work where we're reactive and so we respond to a crisis, but we have this ongoing work. So some of these investigations can take months or even years, and so then we build on the advocacy, our advocacy after that, based on the recommendations from these deep reports, these investigations, and these findings that we have. So we are able to, respond quickly, but we're also able to, leverage off these really deeper investigations that have findings that are useful. In our advocacy.
It is really important, and to be able to not just identify a moment in time, but to hold on to an issue and leverage the work that you're doing. We all see military conflicts around the world. We see the war in Europe. We see the war in the Middle East. We see where militaries and their proxies take control of land or entire countries. For example, in your area of responsibility, Elaine, Myanmar. But are we facing a situation where rogue authoritarian regimes or militaries simply need to outlast that initial outburst of public attention, whether it be from groups like ours or the UN or governments and individuals, and just wait for other crises to come along and wait for us as liberal democracies in particular to be distracted, and then the abuse just becomes normalised? How do we avoid that? How do we avoid that fatigue and maintain that focus on human rights?
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about that, I can't help but think about Afghanistan, which has really faded from the headlines recently. Really once, the invasion of Ukraine happened, we stopped hearing about what was happening to women and girls in Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover. And, the reality is the Taliban did outlast. There were 20 years actually since, Western government intervened in Afghanistan. And, I think following that long period, which did end in defeat after 20 years, we have the Taliban back now. And, the situation is more repressive than ever for women and girls who don't have the right to work, who can't go to school. And, the news rolls on, but the reality is for women and girls living in Afghanistan, their situation remains the same, and it's critical. And so I think the challenge for us as human rights organisations is to keep that focus on what is happening. And we do that through storytelling, through sharing the stories of what's actually happening in that country. We have a big report coming out soon, which will focus on the health crisis in Afghanistan and the way that, previously donor governments had basically propped up and were responsible for the entire public health budget in that country. And when the Taliban took over, I understand that donor governments don't want to support the Taliban. It shouldn't be business as usual. But in terms of the provision of the essential health and services, it's really important to remember that it's often women and girls who are bearing the brunt of these policies. So, through our reporting, we try and do, I think, a bit more sort of shorter, sharper pieces. We do more video. We do a lot of social media because we feel like in order to, mainstream some of these stories that aren't getting enough attention, we really need to highlight individual stories and the impact that this is having on people's lives.
And can I just add to that as well? I think it's, it's two parts. It's keeping it in the public mind, but also keeping it in the mind of governments and decision makers. And so when a report like this Afghanistan report comes out, like Elaine's talking about, my job as the Australia director is then to go to decision makers in the Australian government and be saying, look at this report, look at these findings. What are you doing in terms of your humanitarian assistance? How can you be supporting the women and girls of Afghanistan? And how can you be encouraging other states to do that?
It's really well said, both of you. And Elaine, in terms of your remarks about how a number of these conflicts, almost all these conflicts, have a disproportionate impact on the vulnerable women and girls, and they often are the ones who can't speak up for themselves. So the role and the power of open source in modern society and civil society organisations like yours, we are the ones who can speak up for a number of these vulnerable groups who can't speak up for themselves. Your point about Afghanistan is absolutely right. It also is of interest in relation to people who are focused on Myanmar and trying to keep the Myanmar crisis in both government attention and the public attention. There does seem to have been some renewed public focus recently on Myanmar. The Australian government just last week imposed additional sanctions on the Myanmar military regime, including 2 banks that enable the regime's activities and entities that supply jet fuel to Myanmar's military. What's your view on the current situation in Myanmar? Obviously quite positive that at least there's renewed government and public attention on it. Do you see any prospect for change there?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start telling you a story. I think yesterday or the day before, you get those Facebook memories that pop up, and it was 10 years ago, and I was in Yangon at that time, and the headline of the New Light of Myanmar was Myanmar expresses willingness to cooperate with Human Rights Watch. And I'd taken a photo of the headline of the New Light of Myanmar, which is the government propaganda rag, and it was a photo of my predecessor meeting with Thein Sein, who was the president of Myanmar. And look, back then, 10 years ago, the headline wasn't telling the full story. Of course, there wasn't probably that willingness. But in a decade, what have we seen? We've seen Aung San Suu Kyi, back in jail. We've seen a military coup. We've seen tens of thousands of people arrested. We've seen thousands of people killed. And although in recent months we are hearing that, ethnic armies in a number of areas have overrun military outposts, and, this is causing the Myanmar junta to be on the defensive, what we actually see is that means more use of unlawful airstrikes, more use of air power, which is having a disproportionate impact on civilian lives in Myanmar. So it's really concerning. And so, to come back to your question, we're very pleased to see this positive step of the Australian government issuing more sanctions, but we need better coordination of those sanctions. What we actually need is a global arms embargo on Myanmar. We need to cut the flow of weapons if we are to stop, this strong, well-armed, well-trained military force. And so, what we've seen so far is very piecemeal sanctions by different governments. But actually, we need better enforcement, and we need to work more closely also with, the members of ASEAN and those governments to ensure that they enforce the sanctions that other governments are putting on Myanmar banks and entities.
I couldn't agree more. Both the coordination side and the enforcement side. Without that enforcement, regimes think they can get away with anything. It's interesting. We Elaine, Daniela, we've talked often about the challenge for governments like Australia's of protecting human rights around the world in relation to countries with which we have strong economic relationships. It seems easier to enforce rules and laws and sanctions against those with which we don't have such an economic entanglement with. So we have seen, whether it be with China and in all the countries that China is, if not the top, one of the top trading partners. We've seen in Europe and elsewhere struggles in relation to holding Russia to account over the years, where there are economic dependencies and energy dependencies. We've seen this week China sentence an Australian citizen to death. What's your view on what the Australian government could be doing in this case in relation to Dr. Yang Henjun, who, first of all, held arbitrarily for over 5 years, recently sentenced to death? How should we be, as both government and civil society, dealing with this situation, Daniela?
Yeah, so the case of Dr. Jung is an outrageous situation. He's got this suspended death sentence, which basically means that he has to, be on good behaviour for 2 years, and if he is, that will be commuted to a life sentence. Otherwise, he dies by lethal injection. And we one of the things that we've said continuously is, first of all, this is not the only case like this. There are other people who face arbitrary detention in the Chinese legal system and very harsh sentences. And so we have strongly advocated that although the Australian government has said they're appalled and given all the sort of adjectives you'd expect them to give in expressing their outrage at this situation, that they really need to be engaging in concrete actions. And so, one of the main recommendations we've had is to join with like-minded governments who have citizens, dual citizens, who are arbitrarily detained or facing harsh sentences, to together put collective pressure on the Chinese government to be releasing people in situations like this. Because I think without having firm action, we will see, the government says that until now that they were making representations on behalf of Dr. Jung, but this is where it's ended up. So clearly those representations have not had the impact that we would expect them to have.
Yeah, completely agree. And that is where collective action is vital, whether it be hostage diplomacy in this case, or where China and others use economic coercion or military aggression. China banks on bilateral relationships in which they are far more powerful. Beyond individual cases, we know that many countries in the UN itself have expressed concern about, you mentioned earlier, Elaine's systemic crimes against humanity, including being committed by China in the Xinjiang region. Just last week, HRW released the report entitled Asleep at the Wheel, which I encourage everyone to read. It's detailed how car companies are complicit in forced labour in China. The report highlighted that almost a tenth of the world's aluminium is produced in Xinjiang, and this is a quote, the link between Xinjiang, the aluminium industry, and forced labour is Chinese government-backed labour transfer programs, which coerce Uyghurs and members of other Turkic Muslim communities into jobs in Xinjiang and other regions. Can you tell us briefly about the report's main finding and the challenges, perhaps, of researching this topic?
Yeah, this report, it's not like we, as Human Rights Watch, can travel to Xinjiang in order to interview, the workers in these factories. We have to do open source investigations. There is no access to Xinjiang for independent human rights organisations. There is very limited access for journalists. And there is a high risk of reprisals for anyone who talks to Human Rights Watch, even if they do so, through encrypted technology. So how did we do this? Well, we did it through open source techniques. So we have staff who basically scrape the Chinese internet. They looked at state media articles, they looked at government documents, tender documents, company reports, and they were able to confirm the use of labour transfers from rural to urban areas in Xinjiang to, the smelters that are producing aluminium, to the coal mines and the fire plants where, producing aluminium is a very intensive process. And so, through this work, we were able to prove that, in the cars that we drive, aluminium is a key component to make cars lighter. It's, everywhere in the wheels, in the engine block, in the frame. And, car companies are not doing their due diligence in terms of mapping the supply chain. They can't when it comes to Xinjiang because they don't have access. And so we think that there is a role, for car companies to do their due diligence, but for that to happen, we also need governments to take action. And what we'd like to see is stronger laws that would prohibit the import of any goods that are made with forced labour. Now, the US passed a very strong law a couple of years ago, which acknowledged that the situation is so bad in Xinjiang with the lack of access that there is a presumption of forced labour. And, the EU is currently adopting its own law, which is looking at a ban on any goods made with forced labour. Here in Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act, but frankly, it's not enough. It doesn't have any teeth. And so we want to see reforms to those laws because ultimately, if we want to improve the situation in China, I think the way to do it is to really target the companies that are manufacturing their goods there and for them to insist that the same responsible sourcing standards that apply in other countries also equally apply in the Chinese context. And so far, that hasn't been happening.
It's a very, very important report, and I think your reference there to modern slavery laws, I think the requirement on industry and shouldn't be seen as a burden, but the requirement on industry to do due diligence on their supply chains and actually know the supply chain should just be routine. It should be part of the norm. And so if the answer is, well, there's no evidence here of modern slavery because I just don't know the supply chain, instead of the default being, well, there's no evidence, so therefore everything can go through, the default's got to be if you don't know where your supplies are coming from, then you can't accept it. You've got to be able to prove that you've done that due diligence. So hopefully those reforms, Elaine, that you're advocating for, we do see this year very, very important.
Absolutely. And I mean, also a hat tip to ASPI as well, because, it was your report actually on Uyghurs for Sale that really put these issues of forced labour on the map. And so I think now the next stage is, for companies and for governments to really start acting on that information and enforcing these laws and ensuring that we have strong laws so that, none of us are then worried that the car that we're driving is tainted with forced labour.
Completely agree. All these topics from Afghanistan to Myanmar to China, arbitrary detention, we could genuinely talk for hours. But just a couple of final ones. On a slightly more personal note, Elaine, I sometimes ask in the pods people to recommend books for our listeners, but in this case, you've recently published your own book detailing your experiences defending human rights across the world. It's cleverly titled Chasing Wrongs and Rights, and I really do encourage all of our listeners to read it if you haven't already. But can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, thank you. So it was a bit of a pandemic project. I felt like during the pandemic I had a bit more time on my hands and I wanted to use it productively. And I really wanted to share, I guess, behind the scenes, what it's like working for Human Rights Watch, working on these issues. So each chapter of the book takes a different human rights issue, whether it's offshore detention, whether it's war crimes in Sri Lanka, whether it's trafficking in women. And, I really talk through the successes or the failures that we've had in addressing that issue. And particularly talking, I guess, about some of the steps that it takes to generate change, because it's often something that, it doesn't fit neatly into an op-ed. Change takes years to happen. And I also wanted to share some of the inspiring stories of people that I've met throughout my career who've really inspired me along the way. People like Leila de Lima, the senator who was recently released in the Philippines, and she was in prison for more than 5 years because of her opposition to Duterte's war on drugs. So, I wrote the book, somewhat to also inspire, I guess, the next generation of human rights activists and to give them a good sense of what it's like to work in the human rights field.
It's really excellent, and I think it is important. You've honed in on something quite crucial that we can so often all be captured by what's wrong in the world and so many crises, and we need to bring all those to light. But being able to inspire people into understanding that it is possible to affect change and to influence is just as crucial. We don't want people to say, well, have a fatal view and say, well, I can't, what am I going to be able to do? Therefore, I won't actually try. And that goes for individuals, for companies, for government. So that inspiring aspect is crucial. And I encourage everyone to read it. On that, given so many of the topics do tend to be grim, and whether it be Human Rights Watch shining a light on human rights abuses around the world, or from ASPI's perspective, looking at all the conflicts that we see around the world and trying to deter wars. Perhaps like to give the opportunity to see if we can perhaps end on a more inspiring, as you say, note, more opportunistic note. Are there success stories that you've seen that you can describe that through the work that you've done that progress has actually been made?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as human rights defenders, it's really important to take a moment to share those successes. And often, it is an ongoing battle. You win some, then you feel like you're 2 steps backwards. But it is important to acknowledge where progress is being made. So, for instance, last month on Tibet, the US company Thermo Fisher announced that it will no longer provide DNA kits to the police in Tibet. And this followed years of advocacy by Human Rights Watch and our partners. I think the first report we did exposing this practice of forced DNA collection from Tibetans as young as 5 years old, boys in kindergarten, the first report was back in 2017. So this took a very long time. It also followed a similar decision. We also uncovered similar practices in Xinjiang. Thermo Fisher was quicker to act there. But in this case, obviously what we want to push for is a ban on all DNA sales of kits to China generally, but it is an important step that the company has taken. I think, more broadly, looking at the region over the past year, we've seen, some progress on LGBT rights. So, Japan passed a law that outlaws unfair discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, the law, it isn't everything that activists wanted, but it is a step forward. Thailand's just passed some bills through the lower house of parliament on marriage equality. And if those bills pass in the next few months, Thailand would be the first country to legislate marriage equality in Southeast Asia. And Nepal also has authorised the first same-sex marriage through its Supreme Court. So all of these things follow a lot of activism by my colleagues, in different countries that have been working on these issues for years. And I think, they will have knock-on effects. And then, finally, I guess, we talked quite a bit about China. I visited Taiwan for the first time late last year. And while I was there, I actually went to the White Terror Museum. There's a human rights museum that covers the period of martial law, from 1949 to 1992. And it's in a former prison. There's photos. They've kept the cells. They've kept, some of the rooms as sort of mock courtrooms where people were sentenced through military tribunals. People were sentenced to death. People were sentenced to forced labour. And I was really struck by that because it reminded me so much of what is happening in Myanmar right now, post-coup, with military tribunals in closed courtrooms in the prison. But it was also a stark reminder of how quickly things can change because 1992 is not that long ago. And look at where Taiwan is now. It's a rights-respecting democracy, Chinese-speaking, a place where the economy is really thriving. And that, to me, gives me a lot of hope because it shows that, if we do support the changes that we need to see and if we hold the perpetrators to account, we can see huge generational, changes in our lifetime.
Really well said. A great way to end the pod on. I encourage everyone who has an interest and passion for human rights, the intersection of human rights and security, and personal and collective freedom, realise that you can make a difference as both individuals, but as importantly, as Elaine and Danielle have been talking about, work with others across industry, across government, with international partners, and you can shine a light on both abuses and make progress as well. Thank you for all the work that both of you do. Thank you for joining us on the ASPI pod. Hope to have you back in the not too distant future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin.
Thanks for listening to Stop the World, an ASPI podcast. Follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us each week for discussions on defence, security and geopolitics. If you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests, please email podcast@aspi.org.au.
That's all from us. Thanks for listening.